Hey, RetconRaider here. Today I thought we'd take a quick look at a game that I recently received from a developer I had never heard of before. Today I thought we'd take a look at Vaporum by Fatbot Games. So, what is Vaporum? Well, it's a story-driven first-person dungeon crawler with a heavy emphasis on puzzle solving and strategic real-time combat, based in an immersive steampunk setting. Featuring both a tile-based movement system and a real-time combat system, Vaporum is heavily inspired by classic CRPGs like Dungeon Master and Ultima Underworld, or, more recently, The Legend of Grimrock. But the story, which takes place in a distinctly steampunk setting, is far more reminiscent of games like BioShock. In Vaporum, the player takes on the role of a man who wakes up outside of a massive mechanical tower with no memory of how he got there. With nowhere else to go, he enters the imposing structure, and from there the player has to guide him through numerous levels, solving puzzles, fighting off clockwork monstrosities, and slowly piecing together their backstory, one journal entry at a time. Mechanically, it's the sort of game that can take some getting used to. Although it's presented as a first-person game, the entire map is built on a grid system, and the player moves one space at a time. This can be a bit jarring if you're not used to that sort of movement system, but the player can also toggle to a smoother continuous movement system if they prefer. The bulk of the player's time in Vaporum will be spent exploring sprawling, handcrafted levels, each one deadlier than the last. These levels are heavily populated with puzzles, ranging from simple find-the-button puzzles to more complex puzzles that involve having to do things like moving crates in specific ways or triggering pressure plates in specific orders. Later levels present even more daunting challenges, further complicating the puzzles with things like teleportals and lethal death traps. Solving these puzzles can definitely be a very rewarding experience, but it can also be a bit of a double-edged sword. The levels often require the player to solve these puzzles to progress, only occasionally providing an alternate route, so it can quickly become frustrating if you can't figure out the solution to a particular puzzle. Aside from the puzzles, the other thing the player will also end up spending a lot of their time doing is desperately fighting for their lives against an array of increasingly deadly steampunk beasts, ranging from cute little clockwork spiders, flying industrial drones, massive mutated roaches, automated turrets, and bigger things. I'll avoid going into specifics, but trust me, some of the later enemies can definitely get pretty intimidating. As I mentioned before, combat in Vaporum is handled in real time. Much like in The Legend of Grimrock, the player needs to juke and dodge around their opponents, predicting and avoiding their attacks while also looking for openings to counterattack. It's the sort of combat system that's simple when you're only facing a single foe, but can quickly become more complicated as the player finds themselves facing larger and larger groups of enemies at once. Fortunately, the player has a few tricks up their sleeves. They'll find a wide assortment of loot as they explore the tower, including various pieces of armor and weaponry that can lend themselves towards the player's preferred playstyle. But the player is also equipped with an exo-rig, an armored exoskeleton that enhances their physical abilities and can be equipped with offensive and defensive gadgets, effectively the steampunk equivalent of spells. As the player overcomes more and more challenges, they'll gather Fumium, a mysterious substance that allows them to further upgrade their exo-rig, granting them access to circuit points, which they can then invest in up to 9 different skills to further improve their performance in combat. There are multiple possible builds to focus on, including your conventional sword and board wielding tank, more aggressive dual-wielding or two-handed weapon builds, and glass cannon builds who rely on keeping their distance from threats while barraging them with a constant stream of bullets or elemental attacks. All of these paths are theoretically viable, but combat in Vaporum can be quick and lethal, and healing resources are scarce. It's generally in the player's best interest to be adaptable, changing their tactics depending on the foe that they're facing at the time. Visually, Vaporum is rather gorgeous, presenting the player with a very immersive first-person view of their surroundings. The user interface is rather simple and streamlined, making it easy for the player to keep track of their current status and equipment loadout without drawing too much attention away from the lovely scenery. And the audio is similarly well composed and immersive, focused more on providing ambient sounds rather than catchy music. There is some music in the game, but it generally takes a back seat to things like the hiss of steam, the whirring of gears, and the distant sound of approaching enemies. The game also includes a decent amount of voice acting, both in the form of expository dialogue delivered by the main protagonist as the player explores the tower, but also in the form of phonodiaries, audio logs left behind by the tower's former inhabitants. This dialogue is all delivered quite convincingly, and again really helps with immersion, making the player feel more invested in Vaporum's overarching storyline. So, now that we know more about the game, what's the verdict? Would I recommend Vaporum? Well, it's definitely a very well-presented game, with audio and visual design all intent on adding to the game's incredible immersion. In fact, I'm almost surprised they didn't try to make this a VR title. The writing is also quite compelling, and I did find myself wanting to discover more about the protagonist's story, as well as the story of the tower's former inhabitants. If the game has any particularly glaring weaknesses, it's probably the decision to make it a retro title. You just don't see a lot of real-time tile-based dungeon crawlers, and it's the sort of concept that a lot of modern players might have a hard time wrapping their heads around. Personally, I quite enjoyed it, but I also have a fondness for retro-styled games. As I mentioned before, the puzzles can also be a good or bad point, depending on the player's personal preferences. There are a lot of puzzles in this game, and many of them can become monotonous or repetitive, with later levels involving a lot of crate pushing and button hunting, as well as a fair amount of trial and error. This is somewhat exacerbated by the fact that many puzzles are mandatory. The player can't progress without completing them. There are some optional puzzles, but those generally just reward the player with some extra loot. The combat is a mixed bag. The real-time element definitely makes things a bit more frantic, but the tile-based movement allows the player to approach things strategically, as long as they can read the situation and react to it quickly enough. But many of the maps where the player is forced to defend themselves are very cramped and claustrophobic, meaning that it's a bit too easy to end up backed into a corner with no way to avoid the enemy's attacks, turning the fight into a simple back and forth as you just jam the attack button in hopes of outlasting your foe. And lastly, it's worth mentioning, as a story-driven game with handcrafted levels, the game doesn't have a whole lot of replayability. There are 12 levels to explore, but for the most part it's a fairly linear experience, without many opportunities to help shape the story. But there are multiple possible builds for your character, so I could certainly see playing through the game at least 2 or 3 times, just to try out different combat strategies, or to hunt for secrets or achievements that you might have missed during your previous playthrough. With all that in mind, I'd probably give the game 1 thumb up, or about a 7 out of 10 for those of you who prefer a numerical scale. That means that, yes, I do recommend checking out Vaporum, but only if you enjoy retro-style dungeon crawlers, and have a reasonably high tolerance for convoluted maps and potentially frustrating puzzles. But of course, if you're looking for that sort of game, then Vaporum should be right up your alley, and it even has options to make the experience even more old school, allowing you to disable comfort features such as the auto map and the manual save function. Personally, I'm a big fan of immersive first-person dungeon crawlers, so this game was a pleasant surprise, frustrating puzzles and all. While it's certainly not a perfect game, it's definitely a very promising start for Fatbot Games, and I'm looking forward to seeing more games from them in the future, especially if they decide to make more retro-style RPGs. Vaporum releases on September 28th. It will be available on Steam for about $20 or €20, depending on region. And there will be a 10% discount for the first week after release. At the moment, the game is only available for Windows operating systems, but the developers are hoping to provide versions for Mac, Linux, and consoles in the future. Now, if you'll excuse me, I still have a few more floors of this mysterious tower to explore. So for now, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Vaporum, You can find out more about the game by visiting the official website or the official YouTube channel. Links are in the description.